السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. نبدأ على بركة الله الجلسة 14 تحت عنوان التقويم في خدمة التعلم، ويسرني أن أقدم لكم سعادة رئيس الجلسة الدكتور محمد بن عبد الله الزغيبي، الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة تطوير للخدمات التعليمية والمدير العام المكلف للإدارة العامة للمناهج بوزارة التعليم. والدكتور محمد حاصل على شهادة الدكتوراه في تخصص تصميم تدريس العلوم. والآن أترك المجال لرئيس الجلسة لإدارتها والتعريف بالمحاضرة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most gracious and merciful, peace be upon you. I'd like to start with introducing our speaker, Professor Barbara Blake. She is the director of Burroughs Center for Testing for nearly 30 years now. She received her PhD from the University of Iowa 1967. She specializes in standard setting, validity, computerized adaptive testing. She has authored over 200 journal articles, book chapters, conference papers, and other publications. In 2006, she received the NCME Award for Career Contributions for Education Management. Welcome to this wonderful session with Professor Barbara. We are profoundly pleased to have you, Barbara, in our session and in Saudi Arabia. So, yes, please.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. First of all, I want to thank the scientific committee for putting together this outstanding conference on the assessment of learning outcomes and for inviting me to participate. I'm honored to be part of it, and I've already learned a lot, not only about assessment of learning outcomes, but also about the culture and history of Saudi Arabia. I want to thank the National Center on Assessment for their hospitality and generosity. This has been a very rewarding experience for me, both personally and professionally. Before I start on my topic for today, which is I've titled Assessment in the Service of Learning, I wanted to mention that this is a bit of a departure from the other sessions that we've heard so far in the conference. The other sessions focused on the assessment of learning outcomes, which is appropriate since the conference is the assessment of learning outcomes. But they looked at this mostly from a summative perspective. My presentation is going to be focused more on the assessment, the use of assessment in contributing to learning of these outcomes and in informing instruction. So my focus is more on a formative approach. But mostly what I'm going to be talking about today is what educators and teachers need to know in order to build assessments that will inform instruction and support learning. As a broad overview of my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about three major areas. The first is to identify classroom assessment literacy components. What I'm beginning talking about are what are the indicators that would be important to represent high-quality assessments that are used in the classroom. Next, I'm going to talk about a project that was focused on the assessment of teacher assessment literacy. And then finally, I'm going to turn my focus back to the theme of assessment of learning competencies and make a recommendation of a different approach that might be helpful in measuring student outcomes using what I'm going to call just right assessments. Assessments have the potential to have a major impact both on instruction and student learning. Later in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about some studies that have shown that the use of formative assessment can have a significant and meaningful impact on student learning of educational outcomes. But these articles don't emphasize is just any old formative assessment isn't going to work. You need to have assessments that have high quality if you're going to get the benefits that they have the potential for improving student learning. Most teachers and educators need more knowledge about assessment in order to benefit from the use of assessments to improve instruction. And when we do educational classes at the universities for preparing teachers, we often talk about these really important characteristics of tests and how they support high-quality assessments. We talk about reliability and validity, fairness, scaling and equating, and most teachers' eyes just roll in the back of their heads. They have no idea how to apply that in their teaching practices. So what I want to talk about today is taking these ideas about high-quality assessments that in the psychometric field we think are fundamental, and most teachers and educators think it's psychometric jargon, and translate it into practices that would be directly applicable in their classroom practices. So I'm going to be talking about, instead of validity, I'm going to talk about right stuff. And instead of precision of measurement, I'm going to be talking about right level and right time, and I'm going to be talking about fair content, I'm going to be talking about fair interpretations, I'm going to be talking about right grades. So I'm going to try and take these principles of psychometric practices and translate them into educational practice. Now, when we're talking about the right stuff, typically and traditionally, people think about, well, is the content the right content? Is it the appropriate balance? Is it the appropriate level? And I'm going to ask you to think about this from a different perspective. And this is a perspective that Dr. Coe introduced in the session earlier this morning. And that is to think about what is the interpretation that is intended through the assessment. When you're developing the assessments, ask the question, why do I need to know this? Why is this information going to support my intended interpretation? If my intended interpretation is that they've mastered the learning outcomes, then I have to be very attentive to make sure that my test covers the content at the right cognitive levels. But if my intent is to make diagnostic decisions about where there's errors in a student's information, I'm going to design the test very differently. So the right stuff depends on what's the interpretation that I want to use with the test scores. This is a fairly new approach to assessment development that's called evidence-centered design. And with evidence-centered design, what's on the test is driven by what kinds of interpretations you want to make about the results. And this is the heart of validity evidence. For the right time, is the test being administered in the appropriate sequence of instruction? Teachers use a lot of information, and they gather this information in a variety of ways. They do informal observations and gather information about how students are learning. They give small assessment tasks like quizzes to make sure that the students are on track in the path towards mastering learning objectives. And they give more formal summative assessments to document the achievement of the learning objectives. The frequency of these assessments depends on the level of the students and the complexity of the material. I like to think about assessments broadly as any systematic observation of behavior. Fair and right content. You know, really, this is pretty simple. You want students to do well on the test because they've learned the content, they have high achievement. And this is kind of hard to say, but you want them to do poorly on the test if they haven't learned the content, haven't had appropriate achievement. And anything that distracts from that direct interpretation of they did well on the test because they knew the stuff and they did poorly on the test because they didn't, contributes to unfair testing practices. I want to give two examples of unfair testing practices. The first has to do with cultural influences. And this is a situation where the student knows the material, but is presented with a task or a question that's situated in a context that they don't understand. So it is in an appropriate context, and so that inhibits their ability to show that they know the content. And the example that I want to tell you about, I consult with the Ministry of Education in Toronto, Canada. In Toronto, the province of Ontario, in Ontario, Canada, the province is huge. And they have big cities like Toronto, and they have very rural locales that are very different culturally from what's going on in Toronto. And the question was on the elementary school comprehension test, and it was about a subway. Now, in Toronto, and in many major cities, I don't know if this is true in Riyadh, they have underground subway systems where trains run underground and people take them around so they don't have to drive in all that traffic. Also, in Canada, but also a lot of places in the world, there's a store called, it's a sandwich shop called Subway. Do you know Subway? Yeah, okay. So the question on the test was about a schedule for the subway system. The students in the remote part of Ontario had never seen a subway, but they'd seen the Subway sandwich store. And so they were trying to interpret this question as it pertained to the Subway sandwich store. And so they could have known what to do if they hadn't been confused about the term subway. So that, I thought, was a really cool example of how one word could be interpreted very, very differently. Another example, and this is the example that Sue Brookhart mentioned in her presentation yesterday, has to do with irrelevant variables that confound the ability of the student to demonstrate that he or she actually can perform the task. Sue was talking about a reading comprehension task where the reading comprehension was in a context of very complicated vocabulary and complex sentence structures. Now here's the key point. If the construct that you're trying to measure is, can the student understand comprehension with complex vocabulary and difficult sentence structure, then that's perfectly fine. But if instead you wanted to know if they could understand a reading passage and make inferences from the passage, then that complexity of the vocabulary and the sentence structure interferes with the student's ability to demonstrate that he or she can make inferences. Another example is with mathematics word problems, where the student may know how to do the math, but doesn't have the reading skills to understand what the question is presented. So these are two examples of how these variables can affect the performance of students. So in the assessment design, the goal is to remove what we're going to call construct irrelevant variables. These are those variables that interfere with being able to make the direct interpretation that the students do well because they know the material, the students don't do well because they don't. These variables create barriers for the student to be able to show what they know and are able to do, and it distorts the meaning of the scores, which leads to unfair testing practices. So now I'm going to talk about the right level. And this also refers in many ways back to Dr. Spady's presentation on Tuesday night, when he was talking about you want the students to be able to demonstrate what they are able to do, and they don't have to necessarily do it in the same time frame or within the same construct of conditions. What I'm talking about here is making sure that the tests are appropriate for the student's developmental level. And that can be too high, but it can also be too low. And again, you may think that you want to have the test all at the same developmental level, but depending on the construct, for example, but we just talked about with mathematics, you may need to lower the reading level in order to allow the students to access the mathematics component of the test. When I'm talking about right interpretation, I'm really talking about reliability. I'm talking about having enough information from the test to support the intended interpretations. It's not only enough information, but the right kinds of information, because we want to be able to generalize this score to a broader domain. And if on your test you misrepresent the domain by leaving out a fundamental part of it, then the score will no longer generalize to the full domain. This is particularly problematic with subscores and diagnostic testing, because often there are not enough items on the test or sufficient sampling from the domain to be able to interpret the performance on the subscores either reliably or validly. And so this is a major problem with subscore interpretation. I went to the National Center on Tuesday, a Monday afternoon, and they were talking about grades and how grades in the kingdom keep inching up and getting higher and higher for students, and how the grades are contributing to a distortion in how to use that information for making decisions about student overall competency. Problems with letter grades is there's so much variability from content area to content area, classroom to classroom, and at least in the States, many teachers add in other stuff rather than achievement. They'll add in, are they good citizens? Do they participate in class? Do they play well with others? Do they show good effort? And so the grade that you see, which you want to interpret as achievement in the content area, is confounded because it has all of these other factors that are contributing to the value. Now, in the States, some school districts have said, we can solve this problem. We're going to standardize grades. We're going to standardize what contributes to the grades. We may have separate scores for effort, separate scores for good behavior, but the grade is going to be specific to achievement. And we're going to standardize the grades by giving criteria for what performance warrants a grade. They'll say you have to have 92%, for example, or higher to get an A, and then they'll set a boundary for B, 85 to 91. But this is such an illusion of standardization because it doesn't take into account the difficulty of the test. One teacher's test, it could be super easy to get 92%, and other teacher, it could be almost impossible. That's what my students said about some of my tests, to get to 92%. So it's an illusion of standardization. So what I just covered was my attempt to take the fundamental properties of assessment quality and translate them into practices that would be more meaningful in the classroom for formative and summative assessments that teachers would design and use. Next thing in my agenda was to talk about a project that was devoted to measuring teacher assessment literacy. This was a collaboration in the 1990s. I noticed that I said 1900s. That would have been a long time ago. It was a collaboration in the 1990s between the National Council on Measurement and Education, the American Federation of Teachers, and the National Education Association, funded by a grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. As an aside, I was president of the National Council on Measurement and Education when we got the grant, so that's one of the primary reasons why I had the opportunity to be involved in this. Through these three organizations, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, they represent most of the teachers throughout the United States, from elementary through high school. In this collaboration, we developed a set of standards for teacher competence in the educational assessment of students. These standards were endorsed by all three organizations, and the intent of these standards was to bring attention to the needs of assessment literacy for teachers, both in their training programs and in professional development. There are 7 standards in the standards for educational teacher competency and the educational assessment of students. They cover choosing assessment methods. Many times teachers have a lot of resources available. and they have to decide which of these resources are appropriate for the particular use that they're be using for the test. Developing assessment methods, administering scoring and interpreting assessment methods, using assessment results in decision-making, using assessments for grading, communicating assessment results, and recognizing unethical assessment practices. So this is what these national organizations believed were important for all teacher educators to know in order to be assessment literate. Once we've had these 7 standards, NCME embarked on a project to develop a test. This project had a national advisory committee, and Tony, I don't know if you remember, but Dr. Nitko was on the advisory committee for this project. We developed a 35-item instrument, 5 items for each of the 7 standards, and we did a national assessment of teacher assessment literacy using this teacher assessment literacy questionnaire. It involved all 50 states. Our sampling plan was to contact the chief assessment officer in each state and work with that person to geographically represent elementary and secondary schools in their state to administer the test to the teachers. We were really disappointed in the results. None of the areas showed very high achievement, and the 2 areas that showed the lowest achievement were communicating assessment results and recognizing unethical testing practices. And I think the latter one is really disturbing. NCME then developed a series of professional development modules that could be used to help enhance the assessment literacy for teachers. Now, this was done in nearly 25 years ago, and there have been several attempts to redo this national assessment, but I haven't personally tried to do it, but I've worked with people who wanted to, and the main issue is funding, to find the money to support this national administration. But it makes you wonder if the results would be different now as opposed to then, in particular because there's been a lot of attention, particularly in the States, to assessment, particularly the educational assessment of students. For one example of why you might have different results now is this teacher assessment questionnaire, literacy questionnaire, has been used a lot. Because I was the principal investigator and the publisher of the article about this national assessment, I'm the one that people contact when they want to get access to the teacher assessment literacy questionnaire. And I get lots of requests. And by the way, at the end of my presentation, you'll see my email address. And if you'd like to see this assessment or get access to it, NCME purposely did not copyright the assessment. And so it's free for anyone that would like to use it. It's been translated into many different languages in many different countries. It's been in Europe, it's been in Asia, it's been in China, India, South America. I'm wondering, Saudi Arabia next. So this test has been used a lot to monitor and identify where weaknesses might occur in the assessment literacy of teachers. The No Child Left Behind legislation, Dr. Nitko talked about this in his presentation. In the states starting in the early 2000s, every state was mandated to develop their own assessment programs and to also articulate the learning outcomes for those assessments. So there's been a lot of testing going on, and the teachers have been learning a lot about assessments, and I think that would improve their assessment literacy. There's a training institute in Portland, Oregon called the Assessment Training Institute that gives workshops for teachers and educators. The research that I talked about earlier, where the use of formative assessment revealed meaningful and significant improvements in student learning, that's the Black and Willem research. This research there was an attempt to use a randomized controlled trial to see if those same results would occur in a more controlled environment. This was undertaken by the Mid-Continent Regional Educational Lab, and Sue Brookhart and I were on the advisory committee for this project. Long story short, using these assessment literacy training and formative assessment practices did improve classroom test performance for students, but did not improve, the focus was math, did not improve the mathematics achievement on the state assessment. But frankly, that state assessment was pretty impervious to teacher assessment practices, so I wasn't surprised that we didn't see much change. The Burroughs Burroughs Center for Testing, and Kurt Geisinger is the current director. I was the previous director of the Burroughs Center for Testing, and they recently created the Burroughs Institute for Assessment Literacy, and they're planning to do webinars and training programs to improve teacher assessment literacy. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is going back to thinking about assessment of learning. And think about a different model. This model isn't all that different from what Dr. Spady was recommending, in that the students would be tested at the right time. But I'm suggesting that this right time is just kind of like the just-in-time physics model, where after the student has been working on a learning objective, then's the time to give them the assessment. In the States, they wait until the end of the year, and they give them these what I call epic assessments that sometimes take up to 10 hours for any one content area. I think it would be much better and have clearer interpretation if the assessments were at the right time and at the right developmental level. Unlike Dr. Spady, who was suggesting more time for the students to get to where they needed to go, I'd like to recommend computerized adaptive approaches so that the one-size-fits-all model is no longer used. So these end-of-year assessments really don't meet the high-quality indicators that we talked about for classroom assessments, because they're not measuring the right stuff at the right time. Many times they have inappropriate construct-irrelevant variables. They're not at the right level because they use this one-size-fits-all model for everybody, which leads to invalid score interpretations and inappropriate grades. I want to just say one more thing about this teacher assessment literacy project. We also did a project that involved involved principals and superintendents. And we developed a set of standards for what principals and superintendents need to know about assessment, and I'd be happy to tell you more about that if you wanted to ask about that in the questioning session. So here's my email address. If you can't read it, it's B, my first initial, Plake, P-L-A-K-E, at UNL, that's University of Nebraska Lincoln.edu, and I would be happy to hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. This is wonderful, insightful, accessible, leaving the jargon aside from your presentation and hitting the underpinnings of assessment. You are the champion of today. Thank you. Before the session, Barbara came to me and said, Muhammad, I am bored with this presentation and I don't expect to receive challenging questions. So how can you help me to receive some challenging questions? So I promised her to do an activity to have profoundly and thoughtful questions. So I'm going to ask you, every one of you, for 30 seconds to think about two things. Something that you liked in the presentation that is new and you like to ask more about it. Second, something that you expected to see in the presentation, but it was missing, and you'd like to ask Barbara about it. So take your time, everyone, 30 seconds, think about two things, please. نريد شيئين. الشيء الأول شيء جديد في البرزنتيشن تريد أن تعرف عنه المزيد، والشيء الآخر شيء توقعت أن تراه في العرض لكنه كان مفقود منه. ترى في واجب ثاني بعد الواجب هذا، اللي ما يحل الواجب الأول عنده مشكلة في الواجب الثاني. Okay. Now we would like everyone to talk to the person next to you on the right and agree in one question. Agree in one question, whether related to the first thing that you liked or the thing you like that was missing and like to ask about. If you don't have someone on your right, just the one on the left. We'll give you 1 minute to agree in one question. Take your time. The one on the right or the left. Agree in one question. كل واحد يتحدث مع الشخص اللي بجانبه على اليمين ويتفقون على سؤال من ما كتبوه في الواجب الأول، شيء أعجبك وتريد السؤال عنه أو شيء تفتقده وتريد أن تسأل عنه. الشخص على اليمين، أو إذا كان ما في أحد على اليمين الشخص اللي على اليسار. You will receive challenging questions. They are working hard.
You're making me nervous.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have two rules for the questions. A question is a statement that ends with a question mark. It's not a reflection, it's not a comment, it's a question. The second thing, we'll take question from each side, one from the lady side and one from the gentleman side. So, الأخت المنسقة في قاعة النسائية لو تبدأين من عندك لو تكرمتي بإعطاء الأسئلة مع التعريف بالاسم والجهة ثم السؤال والسؤال يكون مركز وقصير. القاعة النسائية.
أيوة دكتور جاهزين لحظة.
تفضل إذا سؤال تعريف بالاسم والجهة ثم السؤال.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Alia Mitchell from Prince Sultan University. I have one question about something that she was discussing, which is, what do you recommend as the best practice to develop questions that will measure the learning outcomes? This is in reference to when you were talking about the constructs and trying to measure the questions for the students and making them easily understood by the students.
Would you please repeat the question?
Okay, I'll repeat it again. Sorry. What do you recommend as the best practice to develop questions that will measure the learning outcomes so that the students readily understand the questions, the constructs, as you referred to in your presentation?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I really prefer simple is better is in the language. So lots of teachers like to take the opportunity to make the question a learning opportunity. We're not here to learn in the test. We're here to demonstrate what we know. And so I look at the question and say, is it clear what I want the student to do? And is it clear how they're supposed to show me that answer? And those are the two key things: simple language, simple directions. Tell me what you want, tell the student what you want him to do and how.
Thank you. A question from the gentleman's side. On the top, please. Yes, you, please.
Thank you very much. My question about the 7 standards you referred to, and it sounded to me these are more like summative-oriented standards. The question is, what are your recommendations to move away from that summative perspective in the assessment literacy standards to a more formative-oriented paradigm? Thank you.
You know, I don't see the summative hallmark in those 7 standards. I could see where you could take them and apply them in summative assessments, but I can also easily see how they could be applicable in formative assessments. The point goes back to the validity evidence. What's the purpose? What are you trying to do? And then what is the evidence that you need to have in order to support that interpretation? And if the interpretation is formative, that'll inform a lot of things about the kinds of questions, the kinds of feedback, the timing, the developmental level. So I think many of us have a frame of reference that's summative, but if you step back and take a higher view and think about what's the purpose, I think you'll see how those will apply across the board for formative assessments. It's a very good question, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Barbara. The ladies' side. بناخذ إذا تكرمت سؤال من الأخوات بعدين سؤال. أنا ودي إذا في أسئلة باللغة العربية أيضا، إذا أحد الأخوات عندها يعني أسئلة باللغة العربية جيد أن يكون أيضا نسأل باللغة الإنجليزية ومرة أخرى باللغة العربية. الأخوات تفضلوا إذا في أسئلة باللغة العربية أو باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن أنا أفضل أنه يكون باللغة العربية.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
سلام. طبعا. الاسم والجهة لو سمحتي.
الدكتورة مها كلاب، مديرة تطوير التعليم الجامعي في جامعة دار العلوم. سؤالي هل هناك مصفوفة تتلاقى بين تقييم أو مخرجات التعلم الموجودة ميدانيا في الجامعة للطالب مع المصفوفة المطلوبة في NCAA أو هيئة الاعتماد الأكاديمي للتقويم؟ هل هناك تلاقي بمصفوفة واحدة تجمع بين الاثنين توصي فيها الأخذ؟ شكرا.
Let me try and rephrase your question to make sure I understand it. It sounded like you were looking for some kind of criteria that a test would need to represent or be evaluated at in order to be identified as a high-quality assessment. Am I close?
It seems to me she asking about the alignment between the measurement of learning outcomes at the university level and university level, and how to align them with the outcomes required by there is an organization in Saudi Arabia that observe and accredit the university programs.
Yeah, I think I really don't know enough to answer that question directly, but the question about alignment of learning objectives across different levels is something that we talk about in the States when we look at what we call vertical scales. And so in the States, we'll have assessments that go sequentially from third grade to fourth grade to fifth grade, and there's an intended vertical alignment of the learning objectives as you move from third grade to fourth grade to fifth grade. And when there are assessment scaling designs that will allow for you to put on the same vertical scale performance in, say, reading comprehension that spans from third grade to eighth grade, so you can see how students are growing on this vertical scale. So that's one way to align across different levels, and that seemed to be relevant, although the question was at the college level.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, دكتورة مها. عندنا سؤال في الأسفل ثم بنطلع في الوسط بعد ما نأتي من الأخوات. تفضل الله يسلمك.
شكرا جزيلا. اسمي إبراهيم الدوسري. سؤالي بقولها بالعربي بقولها بالإنجليزي. I will say it in English first.
Oh, good. Then I can hear.
I will say it in English first. The ECD, the Evidence Center Design.
Right.
Has it been implemented or used to improve teacher assessment competencies? And do you see a way of utilizing that type of model in improving teachers' assessment competencies? سؤالي بالعربي في ديزاين يسمى ECD design اللي هو Evidence Center Design. سؤالي هل بالإمكان استخدام هذا النوع من المفاهيم في تطوير قدرات التقييم عند المعلمين؟ شكرا.
شكرا الله يسلم.
I don't know whether any teacher assessment or licensure test has used evidence-centered design as of yet, but I know that it's becoming very prevalent in assessment programs in the States, and so I think there's excellent promise for the use of evidence-centered design in that context. Again, the hallmark of evidence-centered design is building validity into the test as you develop the test. And it's real hard to argue that that isn't a good approach.
شكرا. Thank you very much. الأخوات إذا في سؤال ولا عندنا الكثير من الأسئلة هنا إذا ما عندكم أسئلة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نشكر الدكتورة على المحاضرة الجميلة. دكتورة غادة النور، جامعة الدمام، كلية التربية بالجبيل، مركز الاختبارات. حقيقة عجبتني جدا فكرة ضرورة وضع معيار لكفاءة المدرسين في تقييم الطلاب. فمن خلال المحاضرات اللي حضرناها
لو سمحتي أبى أقاطعك، لو سمحتي نريد سؤال لو تكرمتي وليس تعليق.
النقاط الأساسية اللي ممكن إحنا نضعها في هذا المعيار حتى يسهل إلينا تنفيذه.
أي معيار الله يسلمك؟
معيار كفاءة المدرسين في تقييم الطلاب. أهم النقاط الأساسية اللي يشتمل عليها المعيار عشان نبدأ في تنفيذه إن شاء الله.
You're asking which of the, if I were to rank order them in importance?
هل ممكن تعيدين السؤال يعني
أهم النقاط الأساسية في معيار كفاءة المدرسين في تقييم الطلاب حتى نبدأ في تنفيذه إن شاء الله. نسبة لأهمية الاختبارات ووجود فجوة بين الاختبارات وعدم قياسها لنتائجات التعلم.
I think I understand the question. I'm going to answer it this way and see if this will answer. I think there are two fundamental important criteria for all assessment practices, not just for teachers assessing students, and that is validity and fairness. And they go hand in hand, because unfair testing practices results in invalid interpretations of test results. And so having the right stuff and having it in fair presentations that don't restrict the ability of the students to show what they know and are able to do. I think those are the fundamental features of all assessments, and in particular in classroom assessments with teachers.
Thank you very much. أنا وعدتك إني أعطيك فرصة للسؤال، لكن جتني شكوى الآن من اللجنة المنظمة إنه لازم يقولون تعطي اليمين ولا تعطي اليسار، يقولون شكلك مركز على الوسط، فاسمح لي أخذ من اليمين أو اليسار إذا ما عندك مانع. إذا كان أحد في الجهة اليمنى. Yes. في واسطة هنا.
Okay.
There is a Y vitamin in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Blake. Thank you. You talked quite a bit about the assessment literacy of teachers. What do you think about the assessment literacy of government officials who actually set policies on testing, and what could and should we be doing about that?
Well, I think you know this is a pet peeve of mine, an area that I think is in vast need of attention, because policymakers have made very bad policy around assessments. And because of that, I think it has done major damage not only to the school system, but to the teachers and to the students. And I'm talking in particular about in the states where policymakers have decided to use student test scores in the evaluation of teacher merit, and using those test scores to evaluate schools on their quality, when their teachers have no control over the students that come to their classrooms or the socioeconomic conditions under which they are teaching. And I think that's fundamentally unfair and very bad policy.
Okay, when I go a different strategy because we just have 5 minutes left.
Wow.
So I'm going to take 3 questions at a time from each side. And if you could please write them down, Barbara, to collectively answer them. I'm going to start with the ladies' side. إذا ممكن لو سمحتوا تأخذون 3 أسئلة مرة واحدة متوالية وتكون أسئلة والدكتورة بتحاول تجيب بشكل جماعي عليها في الأخير. 3 أسئلة من الأخوات.
عفوا دكتور، يبدأوا في طرح السؤال أو كيف؟
اي طرح السؤال، لك 3 أسئلة مرة واحدة إذا في 3 أسئلة عندكم.
بإذن الله، شكرا.
ما راح تجيب يعني على كل سؤال، بتاخذ الأسئلة وتجيب عليها بشكل جماعي.
أوكي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. عايشة فؤاد أبو شنب، إدارة تربية وتخطيط، جامعة أم القرى. أسعد الله مساءكم بالخيرات، أسعد الله هذه الوجوه الخيرة والعقول النيرة. سعدت وشرفت جدا بهذه الملتقى بكوكبة من خبراء التقويم. التقويم ضروري للعمل الأكاديمي.
أنا ودي لو سمحتي تدخلين في السؤال، الله يطول عمرك. السؤال مباشرة.
طيب، التقويم ضروري للعمل الأكاديمي والإداري وخاصة التعليم العالي في كافة العمليات الإدارية من تخطيط وتنظيم. السؤال الذي يطرح نفسه الآن: ما هي إسهامات التقويم في الإدارة وما هي إسهاماته في التنمية الأكاديمية؟ شكرا.
سؤال آخر.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Sarab al-Muhadib, faculty member in Prince Sultan University. Dr. Barbara, thank you for this presentation. I have rather a simple question. Let's say I have 4 course learning outcomes in my course.
لا ترفعين الصوت بس لو سمحتي.
Let's say I have 4 learning outcomes in my course, and one of these outcomes is associated with rather a difficult or complex topic, and it requires considerably more reinforcement in time than the other topics. However, all of the 4 learning outcomes, all of the topics associated with these outcomes are equally important. Now, what is the right grade in this case? Would I assign more weightage to assessment related to this CLO, or shall they be all equally graded? Thank you.
Thank you. السؤال الأخير من الأخوات.
دلال القحطاني, College of Dentistry, King Saud University. My question is about the inflation of grades that is facing most of the institutions. My question here: what is the wrong here regarding in terms of the 7 standards? So what is the cause related to those 7 standards? Thank you.
شكرا. الآن 3 أسئلة. أبو محمد كان عندك سؤال، تفضل.
شكرا للدكتورة باربرا، الحقيقة محاضرة قيمة. هناك لا شك بأن التقويم الجيد يعطي حكم جيد. دكتورة، فيها عدة مداخل لعملية التقويم، من ضمنها ما يعرف بالتقويم المستمر لطلاب التعليم العام، ويؤكد هذا على أن
أنا ودي الله يطول عمرك السؤال مباشرة.
نعم، يركز على أن هل الطالب أتقن أو لم يتقن. ما رأي الدكتورة في هذا النوع من التقويم؟ وهل ترى الدكتورة أن الاختبارات التي تقدم للطلاب هي لتحديد مستوى الطلاب أو للتأكد من فهم الطالب للمعلومة؟
Is the assessment to know the student in which level, or to know what did he learn?
Oh, okay. I think I am.
السؤال من الجهة اليمنى. أنت كنت طالب من الأول. أي من عندك، الله يسلمك.
Thank you. My question, my name is Hashim Al-Samadani, I'm at Al-Qura University, regarding the teacher assessment literacy project. And that was conducted 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago. Now my question is, if you were to serve again in such committee or such project, what would you do different? And what would you add differently? Thank you.
طيب، السؤال الأخير من الجانب اللي هنا عندنا واحد بس في طالب من أول في الأعلى. تفضل الله يسلمك. الأخ اللي واقف آخر سؤال. الأخ اللي واقف لو سمحت يكون سؤال قصير ومركز لو تكرمت.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. دكتور جمال الدماصي، مقوم بجمهورية مصر العربية بوزارة التربية والتعليم. أود أسأل الدكتورة ما هي أهم السمات الشخصية التي يجب أن تتوفر لدى شخصية المقوم التربوي حتى يمكننا اختياره وتدريبه على برامج تدعم وعيه بالتقويم ويصبح بالفعل مقوما حقيقيا في المجال التعليمي أو وبشكل أخص في نواتج التعلم. شكرا.
شكرا. So it's your turn, Barbara. I know it's hard to deal with this question, but you know, you could, you know.
Okay. On the question about which is the most important feature, okay. Do you want me to start?
You know, just collectively answer them, and you could, you know, take the key points in every question.
Oh, okay. Well, there's been several questions that are related to educational administration. And there's a question that just came in from the other side about what's more important for educational supervisors. Should they be, for the superintendent, should they be educational supervisors or should they be evaluators? And I can't answer those questions, but I can tell you the methodology that we used when we were developing the standards for principals and superintendents. And what we did was basically a job analysis. We conducted focus groups to ask these administrators how they used assessments, how they used the results, what were their demands on them with regard to assessment. So when we got a list of the ways that they used assessments, and then we did a national survey of principals and superintendents and asked them for each of these statements, what was the frequency, how often did they have to do this task, and what was the criticality, how important for your job. And I think that that kind of data would answer the questions that you're asking. I'm not able to prioritize, but I can suggest a data source that can give you that information. Okay, so that's one of the points.
We have 2 minutes left.
Okay. In the standards for teacher competency in the educational assessment of students, one of the standards is using assessment information for assigning grades. And in that component, it talks about ensuring that the evidence that you're using to assign grades is based on competencies rather than, as I said, things, extraneous things like behavior and comportment. So that methodology of using multiple, it also talks about using multiple indicators over multiple time so that there's evidence that would be accumulated and weighted. So there's a lot more to assigning grades than what Susan Brookhart would say, just adding up the points. You need to put in the value weights. You need to get information from different aspects of what you're trying to represent with the grade. And using that kind of model, you would have the ability to help, I think, change the direction of the grade inflation. Because I think right now the grades are being assigned without the sufficient thought for what they should represent.
That's all. Thank you very much. On behalf of Qiyas and on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. Barbara, you made our afternoon. Thank you very much.
نشكر الجميع على تفاعلهم.
لو تفتحون المايك للدكتور أيوة. Okay, go ahead.
I just would like to thank you for your attention and your interest and your very challenging questions. I'm not bored anymore.
الشكر للجميع على حضورهم وتفاعلهم. الآن يتفضل سعادة رئيس الجلسة الدكتور محمد بن عبد الله الزغيبي بتقديم درع تذكاري للدكتورة باربا بليك. كما يتفضل سمو رئيس المركز الوطني للقياس والتقويم الأمير الدكتور فيصل بن عبد الله المشاري آل سعود بتقديم درع تذكاري لسعادة رئيس الجلسة الدكتور محمد بن عبد الله الزغيبي. وننوه حضراتكم بأن الجلسات القادمة والتي ستبدأ بعد ربع ساعة من الآن هي الجلسات الأخيرة للمؤتمر، وستكون الجلسات بإذن الله بدايتها عند 1:30 ظهرا. الآن فترة الاستراحة. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الأحبة الدكتور يبدو أنه صار في تبديل، أحد أخذ شنطته، فاللي يتأكد من شنطته أنه مو بله يتواصل مع الدكتور.
الاسم موجود في الجيب الخارجي من الشنطة هاي؟
نعم، الاسم موجود على الجيب الخارجي للحقيبة أو الجيب الداخلي للحقيبة.